So good morning, everyone. So as Satya mentioned, actually she didn't, but what this presentation is about is, before we start the labor panel, I'm going to give a bit of context into the current labor force and population of Sri Lanka. So we'll be looking at some figures and some stats, and in the panel discussion, the panelists will pick up on some of these and discuss the driving factors. So we'll jump straight into it. The first thing we'll look at is the population of the country. So for 2022, UNFPA estimates that the total population will be 21.6 million. And the average annual rate of population change will be 0.3%. So this graph actually shows that the total population of the country has been on a continuous growth since the 1960s. But this growth is not expected to continue for long. According to ADB estimates, this population growth, or this era of continuous population growth, is expected to end in about 2 decades. So the driving factors of this end of an era, essentially, is, first of all, the rapid decline in the fertility rate of the country. So in 1960, the fertility rate was 5.5 for the country, but in 2019, it's 2.02. The other driving factor is the increased life expectancy due to the investments the country made in human development. And our life expectancy is comparable to that of the average upper middle income economies as well. So because of these two driving factors predominantly, the ADB estimates that the population will peak in 2038 and then contract. So after 2038, Sri Lanka will be facing a contracting population. So if you actually analyze the growth or the proportion of the population in each of these broad age groups, you see that due to the factors that I mentioned previously, everyone in the age group, other than everyone in the age group of 65 and above, all the other age groups are going to contract, whereas the number of people in the age group of 65 and above is going to increase. And this has a direct effect on the age dependency ratio, because each member in the working population is now going to have to support people in retirement, essentially. So if you look at some key factors, or key stats actually, we see that the working age population will peak in 2027, and then it will start to decline. Then the population of those aged 65 or more will double by 2040 compared with 2015. Then by 2030, 1 in 5 Sri Lankans will be over the age of 60, and most of it will be women. So this will actually make Sri Lanka one of the fastest aging countries in Asia. So now we'll look at the labor force, where it is currently. So in 2021, according to the TCS definition, which is on the slide, the total labor force was 8.6 million. And the total labor force participation rate was 49.9%. And the unemployment rate was 5.1%. I think one of the key defining features of the Sri Lankan labor force, particularly the labor force participation rate, is that the male labor force participation rate has consistently been higher than the female participation rate. And parallel to that, you can see that the unemployment rate for females are actually much higher than for males. And if you take a look at the change in the labor force participation rate between 2002 and 2020, you can see that the biggest contraction, or the largest contraction, has happened for the age group between 20 and 24. So now that we know the labor force and the proportion of employment essentially, and the labor force participation rate, we'll take a look at where they are located, where they're employed. So if you look at it in terms of the major economic sectors, you see that a majority of them, ranging from 40 to 50%, is actually employed in the service sector. And the graph on the right shows you that in terms of employment status, most of these employees are private employees. And another key feature in the Sri Lankan labor force is that our informal employment is twice, or in most instances, more than twice, our formal employment. So informal employment, according to the DCS, is essentially anyone that is not subjected to national labor legislation, income tax, social protection, and employment benefits. So these could be unpaid family workers, informally self-employed people, domestic workers, as well as informal employees in the formal and informal firms. So the other thing that I want to touch on is the migration, because we can't talk about population and labor force without talking about the migration. So you see the graph on the left actually breaks it down by skill level. So you go from housemaid, unskilled, to professional. And on the graph on the right shows you that the female registrations with Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment, roughly around 90% of the women that register there register for clerical or mid-level, for clerical and related jobs. And I would like to end this presentation by just looking at the stock of migrant labor force that is in the country or has been in the country previously. This model cannot be extended to 2020 and 2021 because the forecasting methodology does not hold due to there was a large number of returnees in 2020. But this is where the migrant labor force is at. So with this, I will end this presentation. The panelists will pick up on some of these numbers and just talk about what drives these, what's causing these numbers to be the way they are. Thank you.
Now invite Dr. Ramani Gunatilake, economist and independent consultant, Ms. Shyamali Ranaraja, attorney at law, along with Amita Arudpragasam, independent policy analyst, on stage.
Okay, so the title of this panel is actually Labor Reforms for Inclusive Growth. And I think a good place to start then is the second part of the title, which is inclusive growth. In Sri Lanka, men are twice as likely to be employed as women. And Sri Lanka actually has the 20th largest female labor force participation gap, or gender gap in female labor force participation. That's a huge problem, given what Udarini has just pointed out, given that Sri Lanka's population is aging, and the working age population is going to be shrinking after 2030. And given that Sri Lanka's labor force participation, female labor force participation, if improved, will unlock certain things for our growth and for gender equality. So my first question is to Ramani. What actually has gone wrong? What is preventing women from joining the labor force at equal rates or similar rates to men? Thank you.
It's on?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about this topic. It's a very complex question, and in fact, I prepared a slide which graphically shows the problem. I hope we can have that slide up. Yes, well, until the slide comes, basically, you have to imagine women as being boxed in by concentric uh, by concentric series of barriers. I have tried to do it to show you in a graphic way with this slide. So if you take the red circle, those are the personal individual characteristics which form barriers to taking on paid work. So for example, if you're not in good health, obviously you will not be able to work for pay. If you are married, then you are less likely to participate in the labor force, and that is basically because of the dual burden women have. Uh, they have their social norms have given them the responsibility over household work and care work. And when you get married, you are running households, you are having children, and then that doesn't give you enough time, and it, or rather, it makes it costly for you to engage in paid work. Then, if you don't even have the O levels, you're only secondary educated, then you are less likely to participate in the labor force, because there again, the kind of job you may find in the labor market is not a good job. So it may make sense for you to stay at home and take your children to tuition classes and do housework rather than go out to work and get a lousy job. Then, of course, skills endowment, as I said, education, composition of the household. If there are more male earners in the family, then women are regarded as secondary earners. They are less likely to go out to work. If you're poor, of course, then you're driven to work, to earn income. So it's distress driven. Then you have the local market conditions, which are another set of barriers which women have to negotiate. Are there suitable jobs nearby? How is the transport? What do employers think of hiring women? By the way, most male employers are unlikely to hire women. There is considerable gender discrimination in the labor market. And then, of course, you have the macroeconomic conditions. And I think you must have learned enough about them in the previous session. So I won't describe that further. If there are questions, I will answer.
Thanks, Ramani, for that comprehensive answer. Another thing that came up in the context slides was our unemployment rates, which are actually quite low. According to the slides, around 5.1% in 2021, and on par roughly with the region. But you've written elsewhere that these rates actually mask another problem, the problem of youth unemployment. Given that we've seen so many young people participating at the recent protests, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the constraints to youth employment and why perhaps young people are finding it difficult to get jobs.
There are many reasons. I think the two most important, that according to my perspective, is first, economic conditions at large. The economy hasn't been generating enough jobs, enough decent jobs for men and women. And in any country, young people find it difficult to get their first job, lack of experience, and so on. So there's a whole bunch of factors in the macroeconomy and the kind of jobs which are being generated by the technologically backward production structures that we have been stuck in for decades. Second thing is, we have a skills mismatch. What employers want, young people don't have. And that goes back to serious weaknesses in our education system. Many Sri Lankans, unfortunately, compare themselves to India and say, oh, we are highly literate, and so on. But actually, India has two countries in there. One country which is highly educated, and the other country in there is not. In our country, what has happened is that in key market-oriented skills are missing from the education system. And this is not rocket science. There have been periodic assessments by the National Institute of Education itself showing how poorly our students perform. For example, in 2016, they found that amongst grade 8 students, 50% got less than 5% passes in maths. About 66% got less than 5% in science. And these are the these are part of the STEM subjects, which we need to propagate, right? It's not happening. International assessments, comparative assessments have shown that our students have not gained anything in terms of cognitive skills, problem-solving skills, the ability to think independently, the ability to pick up verbal clues, context-related questions they cannot answer. So actually speaking, most of our people, our young people, don't have the skills needed for the market. And so our production structures are also geared towards low-skilled work, high concentrations of low-skilled work. And we have been in this rut for decades.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that that's going to get better given that the nature of work is so rapidly changing as well. If we don't update what we provide our youth in terms of skills, then we won't be prepared for the transitions in the future. My next question is to Shyamali. As you know, again, from the context, we saw that levels of informality in the economy are twice as high as levels of formality. And that's not unusual for developing countries, of course, but it is a problem because it means workers aren't entitled to social protection and employment benefits. And you know, we see even in formal firms, there's this use of manpower agencies and so on because of the costs of labor law. Can you help us understand why these costs exist? What is wrong with our labor law that makes informality so much more attractive to workers? And why have previous efforts at reform failed to generate the kind of legal protections that we need?
Thank you, Amita, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to Advocata for inviting me to discuss these issues, which are very important given the context that we are in. I have a few slides, and if I may take a few minutes of your time, because our labor law is a bit complex, so that I can set the stage for the next part of the discussion. Till the next slide comes up, let me explain to you that those of you who are either employers or employees in the private sector or entrepreneurs will know. Right. So Sri Lanka has about 40 laws that relate to employment. And if that's not bad enough, on top of all the bad news that Ramani has been giving you, only about 15 of these are actually in use on a day-to-day basis. We have two different labor law regimes, one for the public sector, which we do not touch today at all because that is at the behest of the Cabinet of Ministers in whichever department they're employed in. And the private sector labor laws are what we are discussing as we are talking about resetting Sri Lanka. But unfortunately, these have not been compiled into a labor code. What is you can find online as labor code is merely a collection of the labor laws. There is no kind of logical sequencing for this. If you are an employer or an employee trying to understand this. Most are dated before independence. I'll put up the list shortly and you can see how far back some of these go. And some of the new developments that Amita and Ramani were talking about are not even contemplated in most of these. And even our amendments are sadly out of date. There are paid leave and holiday anomalies. We look at something which compares sectorally. And that's another problem that we have, that you have multiple laws that apply in different sectors. And it's a sectoral law in some ways, as well as a stratified law. So this is very complex for someone to understand, and labor law should be something which is accessible to everyone, especially to employees. As a lawyer, my bread and butter is the dispute resolution system for any lawyer, and Sri Lanka is completely outdated, overcrowded, and the delays are something which are nightmares for the ordinary litigant. We'll look at some stats as we go on. Employers, unfortunately, in the private sector, bear the total responsibility for many of the costs of labor. Unlike in other countries where unemployment benefits, social security benefits are borne by a central fund or by the state with contributions from employers and employees, Sri Lanka lands the whole lot on the head of the employers. Now, I have a lot of clients who are employers. I'm a practicing attorney as well. Someone recently asked me, why would anyone realistically employ anyone in Sri Lanka? Because it's so complex and it's so difficult. So if I sort of spoil your morning a little bit more, if you look at the labor laws, the first of the big ones that we use on a daily basis, which is the Maternity Benefits Ordinance, was enacted in 1939. Now, this is very salutary from one point of view, because Sri Lanka has been in the forefront of providing for benefits for women. And I know one of the blue chip companies in Sri Lanka just announced that they have awarded equal paternity and maternity benefits to their employees, which is way ahead of where we are right now in terms of the law. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think Ramani will speak of this later on in her discussion as well. But if you look at the years in which at the end of each law, you get the year which it was enacted, you will see that most of them are either pre-independent or immediately after independence. And legal amendments are very slow. And they have not been done in a cohesive way or in a pragmatic way, not aligned with development goals, not aligned with the needs of the country, not aligned with the new skills development that Ramani was speaking of, with such discouragement after many years of campaigning for this. And you can see that it's a piecemeal kind of labor law. So not only is it difficult to understand and to apply and to benefit from, it is also difficult to amend and bring to a point where it is actually useful to reset it for inclusive growth. Not everything is doom and gloom, but I must say the picture gets more complex if it were possible. Not only do we have labor laws and regulations which you must comply by, but you also have agreements with trade unions which also set employment standards. There are customary practices which also have to be taken into consideration. And then you have superior court decisions. We go by the British law system, where superior court decisions set precedents which must be followed by employers and employees. So you can see that the labor law system really creates a lot of work for lawyers, but really doesn't do much for employment growth or for employers and employees to understand and apply and also comply with labor law. So this is where the question that Amita posed to me about informality comes in. In this context, there are more incentives for employers and employees really to stay in the informal sector than to become formalized, than to enter into the formal sector. That is not the only reason for informality, but it is a very big one. So this is why we have something around 58% informal employment, as well as a large proportion of informality within the sector, which is what Amita was referring to earlier. And the labor law, the complexity of the labor law is one of the reasons, one of the large reasons which come there. So let me distress you some more, it seems to me my role today, by looking at paid leave. Now, paid leave is a good thing. It's a bad thing. It's what every employee is entitled to, but Sri Lanka makes it hugely complex by having different leave systems for different sectors. Why? You can ask the parliamentarians who are here and also pose it at your next general election. If you are covered by what is called the Shop and Office Employment Act, which applies obviously to shops and offices, including banks and the retail sector. There's another set of regulations which apply to the wages boards, which are usually the skilled and unskilled categories, which are in trades and essentially in the agricultural sector, so a different set. And the public sector, of course, is here just for comparison. Now, I must also tell you that some employees can be covered by two different laws. If you are working in a factory, but you are in the office as say a timekeeper or HR officer, you would be covered by the Shop and Office Act. So you can't assume, an employer can't assume simply because you're in a trade facility or a manufacturing facility that all your employees are covered by the same law. There would be two disparate systems. Can you imagine the nightmare this is when it comes to rostering of work, scheduling of production? Because as you can see, the leave benefits differ. Under the Shop and Office Act, you have 1.5 days weekly paid holidays, but the Wages Board has only one unpaid holiday very often, sometimes paid, and the public sector, of course, has 2 lovely days off, and now an additional day on Friday as well. So statutory holidays, you have 8 statutory holidays, and the POA holidays. I have clients who have customers in the US, for instance, especially in the IT sector, and I have been sitting in on Zoom discussions where the customer says, really? You have a holiday because the moon is full? This is very difficult to explain. And if you employ someone, it's not that you can't employ someone on the POA day, but if you do, you have to pay an additional half day's wage, regardless of the number of hours worked. So you can see how the cost keeps adding on. And really, nobody can explain to me this question of why do you have a POA holiday? Other than Vesak and Poson and maybe the Perahara holiday in Kandy, where I come from, may be required. But the rest of the days, I know the Sri Lankans here will know that nobody goes to the temple other than the old ammes and the kids who are forced to go to Dhamma school. So, but this is not something that any political party will ever touch either. So we are resigned to having these 12 holidays, which fortunately do fall on Saturdays and Sundays, and you get a little bit of leeway. But that's like Russian roulette. From year to year, you don't know really where it's going to end up. So we have annual, under the Shop and Office, we have 14 days annual leave, which is a good thing. We have casual leave, but not sick leave, which became a nightmare in the pandemic. But some employers do act very responsibly and give sick leave in addition. But look at the public sector. You have 45 days off on top of everything else you already have. So when you look at the total non-working days, now this is factoring in the extra day the public sector has as a holiday on Fridays now due to the transport restrictions, you can see exactly how much Sri Lankans are required to work. And any day on which you have a paid day off and you require an employee to work, you either have to pay premium rates for overtime as considered as being extra time worked, or you have to give a day off, which is another complex thing. So really, the labor law does nothing but add a lot of work to lawyers who want to specialize in labor and employment law. So, but for the ordinary entrepreneur, I'm afraid it's a minefield. Now, very quickly, because I know we are on limited time, but to me as a lawyer, an efficient dispute resolution system is a no-brainer if you want to reset any country and to look at how we can progress, because disputes are part and parcel of human interaction. But Sri Lanka has a very, very well thought out dispute resolution system on paper in the law, but it doesn't work because it's bogged down in delays and extraordinary complications. Now, without going into details of the court system, we have a system for workplace disputes, which comprises of the Department of Labor, which is handled by the Commissioner General of Labor, or the labor tribunals, which are not even part of the court system. They are like grassroots tribunals, where an employer and employee, upon termination, can go and sort out their disputes. And the law, as it was drafted by Parliament, the Industrial Disputes Act, said you must finish, you shall finish this case within 6 months. But what happened? The Supreme Court, I told you earlier, I think, that the Supreme Court decisions also have an impact, said, no, this is not mandatory. This is only recommendatory, and it's only a guideline. So you can take as much as you want, much time as you want. That's not exactly what they said, but that's the way it is interpreted by the LT structure now. And I can tell you that I had a case recently which took 5.5 years from the date of filing to conclusion. And it's not one single reason that contributes to these delays. But the statistics speak for themselves. You can see that institutions and disposals remain virtually unchanged. And I have only given you the data up to 2018 because from 2019 onwards, it's far too depressing to tackle before lunch. But now, with the problems of transport and the 1 day off extra that you get, it has become even more difficult for litigants. So if you are, and I should also explain to you that labor tribunals, after hearing a case, a complaint by an employee that they have been terminated unjustly, has not really a legal jurisdiction, but what we call a just and equitable jurisdiction. So the labor tribunal president has the right to decide whether it is fair. That is all well and good. But the employee can be reinstated in employment with or without back wages. So after 5.5 years, when an employee is reinstated, can you imagine the chaos it creates? Because the company has moved on, the salary structures have changed, promotions have been given, and this employee comes back into the position that he was at the time that he left, because the labor tribunal cannot promote him. So I'm not saying do away with reinstatement, but I'm complaining, I really draw your attention to the delay. Because how can an employer and employee sustain a dispute for 5 years or more? An average, let's say, is about 2.5 to 3 years, when the recommended time is 6 months, and then expect to have a peaceful industrial environment. I have had clients who have come for due diligence reports, and when we report back, they say, no, we don't want to invest in Sri Lanka, external foreign clients, because this time period of dispute resolution is unacceptable to us. We cannot have a business plan where we do not know the outcome of the case for such a long period, and also cannot know whether that person is coming back into our workplace or not. I cannot explain this to my shareholders, my stakeholders, and therefore I would rather go somewhere else where it doesn't take, a legal team of about 15 people to explain all this to me. So this is the problem that we have. So if you ask a practitioner, what are the problems? It's outdated, it's piecemeal, and it takes far too long to resolve disputes. So what we need are things like alternate dispute resolution, mediation, commercially provided mediation, because the Commissioner General of Labour and the Labour Department does provide some sort of mediation, a portion of mediation, but unfortunately they cannot mediate beyond a particular point because they are also enforcers and regulators. And whether that system functions efficiently or not is a whole different panel discussion for another day. But let me tell you that for the entirety of Sri Lanka, there are only about 700 labour officers working out of something like 44 district officers, district and sub-district officers. So you can imagine the sheer lack of capacity in the dispute resolution system to handle any of these complaints speedily. And all these 44 laws and the 15 that are in regular operation, wherever there is a dispute, ends up either in this system or in the Labour Department, where you have these 700 labour officers. And I think that's being optimistic after the pandemic as well, dealing with these problems. So this, in a very extended nutshell, is the answer to your question, I hope. And the point I'm trying to make is that there are far too many incentives and far too many barriers to formalization, both on the part of employers who wish to formalize, enterprises that wish to formalize, as well as employees who would want to work in the formal sector. Thank you, Amita.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. I actually want to ask a follow-up question on this, pertaining to the political economy in which our labour laws are negotiated, lobbied for, and so on. So in Sri Lanka, trade union membership is quite low. It's about 10% of our labour force has membership in a trade union, and that's 350,000 in 2020. So quite low compared to global statistics as well. And my question is, why? Is this because of some kind of politicization of trade unions? Is it something else? And in particular, I want to draw on recent political events as well. We had recently the arrest of a trade unionist, Joseph Stalin. And I have to ask you, is there some kind of a relationship between these persistent crackdowns on trade unions by the political class and the fact that trade union membership is so low? What is the relationship and how does that impact our labor law?
I think Amita is hell-bent on getting me arrested by the time I get out of this hall. But that trade union data, that 350,000, hides also the fact that this is mostly in the public sector. The private sector doesn't have that many, density of trade unionism is quite low in the private sector, despite what people seem to think. And Mr. Stalin is also in the public sector. So the teachers' union that he heads is in the public sector, and trade union membership in the public sector is easier because they are all congested or gathered in one department or one ministry, one sector. So it's easier to unionize them. But in the private sector, it's a different story. We have very fragmented trade unions. Unfortunately, I haven't got the data, but at the last count, these 350,000 members that the Labor Department reports as being members of trade unions were spread across something like 2,000 unions. So you can see the numerical strength of these unions are lower. Some, of course, have large membership, but Sri Lankan law only requires 7 members to sign a certificate of registration for trade union to be registered. So you have sort of a dispersion of the membership over very small trade unions. So their bargaining strength is lower. Their political strength still is to be contended with because of the reputational impact, I think, of trade union personalities. But again, they are outdated as well. Their trade union structures are outdated, and they don't really serve the membership correctly. If I look at things like maternity benefits, for instance, there are large sectors where 90% of the members of a particular trade union is female. But unfortunately, they do not reflect the campaigns, they are not reflected, their interests are not reflected in the campaigns of the trade union, especially because the leadership is all male. Now, I'm not male bashing here, but for historical reasons and practical reasons, women are not reflected in the leadership of trade unions other than in a few plantation sector trade unions. So you have a situation where your membership and your leadership are not in sync. For instance, the Maternity Benefits Ordinance provides for maternity benefits for working women, which have been brought into uniformity now in 2018. But up until then, the shop and office sector had higher benefits than the wages board sector. Now, this is ridiculous because maternity benefits or maternity paid leave is not given for the benefit of the mother, but benefit of the child. So I cannot understand a system where it took so long to change something which should be looked at as the right of a child, and the right of the child should be the same regardless of where your mother is working. Same way, there are no benefits for non-working women. You don't have the same kind of benefits for entrepreneurs or own account workers, unpaid workers, because of this problem where interests of women are not taken up at this level. So you have a failure on part of the system as well as those who are supposed to advocate for the rights of women and the workers themselves. I can give you in any number of examples where their rights are not reflected. And this really has become the problem where getting better conditions are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question is for Ramani. So compounding the problem of Sri Lanka's aging population is the fact that many skilled workers are now, leaving the country because of the economic crisis. There aren't official statistics on this, but anecdotally, there are so many reports of, people, especially in the younger age categories, just migrating overseas, creating some kind of brain drain. I think in some industries, this problem is worse than in others, like the tech industry, for example. My question to you is it just skilled workers who are leaving at this point? And, what can be, you've talked about, skills development and how we need to make sure our skills development is in line with our job needs, but those are perhaps more long-term, projects. In the short run, what is it that we can do to prevent further brain drain?
In the short run, we need political stability. We need to implement a credible structural adjustment program. We need to get out of this economic abyss into which we have fallen. There's nothing going to be quicker than that. That is the situation. And also when it's not just in terms of skills that we are going to have a problem. Basically, if you look at labor supply, you have actual numbers, bodies, right? Then you have the skills. Now, this crisis is hammering both these aspects. One, as you said, is the emigration of skills, and also unskilled workers. They are being driven out by poverty, and it is at those two ends of the skills spectrum that people are leaving. And the middle lot, who even in the best of times were a problem in terms of their employability, we are going to be stuck with more of them. So then the issue becomes, how do we transform these people into the kind of labor force needed, I mean with the skills and all that, needed to help grow out of this crisis, because without labor you can't do it. On the other hand, in a crisis, fertility rates drop. Nobody wants to have children in this crisis. I mean, you're spending time in the petrol queue. One poor woman gave birth while standing in the passport queue. So long term, this is going to have a huge impact on our economy, on our society, because we were already an aging population. Now with this crisis and the impact it is having on the labor market, on the demographic structure of our population, actually the prospect is quite frightening. There aren't going to be people around to look after all these old people, and I will be in that generation. Yes, I mean, there's no alternative to political stability, which is absolutely necessary for a credible economic reform program which will get us out of this mess.
Okay, so related to this, I mean, I know it's quite audacious to talk about like immigration policies when we're still struggling to retain skilled and unskilled labor at this moment when there's an economic crisis. But I've heard so little debate among Sri Lankan policymakers about how we would actually attract talent back into the country. Maybe not right now when there's this economic crisis, but we do need to do this at some point given the outflow of individuals and out-migration. And also given the diversity, talent, and resources in our diasporic communities. Do you think this is a conversation that we need to be talking about or that we need to be having at this moment?
I think we should have had this conversation at least a decade ago, before things got screwed up so bad that nobody wants to come here, everybody wants to run away. I don't think, in fact, I don't think immigration is a priority right now. The priority here is to keep the people we have. Most Sri Lankans who go abroad and settle abroad, they do that not because they don't want to be here. I mean, this is a lovely country, even at the not so best of times, though now it has become very bad. It's just that the opportunities, the culture of political victimization, there is no meritocracy. There are all these problems, these social, political, cultural problems that have to be fixed to make this country attractive again for people to want to come back too. I mean, many people after the war did come back, thinking that things would be better. But you see, the conflict ends, but your underlying problems remain. And actually, those problems got worse. Yeah, so I think it's not a priority right now. It's keeping people here, making it attractive again. That's the priority.
Yeah, and I suppose that relates back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of female labor force participation as well. Like, how do we make workplaces that actually attract women into the the office and into the labor force? How do we create a society that's actually attractive to different types of communities and genders and so on? So we've discussed increasing labor force participation, but perhaps it's just as important to talk about job quality, to talk about decent and good work, and not just more work. For example, women in the plantation sector have the highest labor force participation rates amongst women, but their wages are less than 1,000 rupees a day, and they actually do very, very difficult work. I know that Sri Lanka has seen little change in the structural composition of output in the last decade. Is that a problem? Should we be thinking of ways to move Sri Lankans out of low productivity sectors like agriculture, perhaps, into higher productivity sectors? And relatedly, like, how important is it for Sri Lanka at this moment to be thinking of transitioning able-bodied men and women out of the military or the certain parts of maybe the public sector into other types of jobs?
Well, we don't know how many people the military employ. I don't think the numbers are clear in any country because this is supposed to be a national security problem. But having said that, we don't need to look at the military. The public sector is bad enough. In this country of 22 million people, 1.5 million are employed by the government. This is totally unsustainable. What is their value addition? What is their productivity? What is more, this is not just a question of cost in terms of salaries and a mounting pension bill. It is also in terms of rent-seeking, corruption, obstruction. We have got it's a Gordian knot now, the public sector. And repeated efforts at retrenching have been undone by the politics. Our people, Sri Lankans, have to realize that you can't live beyond your means. That is the fundamental thing. Most people want to live off the government, and a lot of them do. But basically, that has impoverished our country. I mean, it's really time to wake up and smell the coffee here. We cannot employ such vast numbers doing nothing. Having said that, sorry, I went off on a tirade. What was your question?
So I was also talking about the structural composition of output from agriculture, which is also considered a low productivity sector.
Absolutely. At a recent conference organized by the National Science Foundation, some engineers had given some presentations. I hadn't heard this myself, but I heard this through a colleague. They kind of said that we are at IR 2.1 still. Industrial Revolution 2.1. Now, all these other Far Eastern countries, they are in the fourth IR. So, what has prevented us from upgrading our technology? There are many reasons for this. One is, again, the kind of incentive structure. Private sector firms make more money through government contracts, given this skewed system, than in investing in technology and getting the workers and so on. So we absolutely need to support digitalization, support the upgrading of skills, And this is an absolute priority because we have got into this mess because we haven't done this. Quite apart from the fact that people who are managing our affairs, taking decisions, don't know what they are doing. They have no idea of how modern economies work. They think that economy is just a question of giving subsidies across the board. Where is the money going to be generated? Nobody knows. So that the poor quality, or the lack of capacity has been a real problem for our economic progress.
And I imagine we have to do all of this quite carefully as well because, for example, we were talking about women participating in the labor force, but women are predominant in certain sectors like the health and education sector as well. So we want to perhaps think about these quite carefully and not try to, not do this overnight like policy making has been done in the recent past, maybe. Okay, so we've spent some time now talking about the context of labor reforms and some of the problems of labor reform as well. I want to ask both of you what you think are some solutions, and of course to prioritize as well the solutions that you're going to talk about. So what 3 reforms would you recommend to lift Sri Lanka out of this situation and actually to help promote more inclusive growth? So Shyamali, maybe we'll start with you. What 3 reforms should Sri Lanka think about and try to implement now?
Thank you, Amita. Could I just have my last slide back? I just kept that for now. And while we wait for that, let me just jump in and add something to what Ramani was saying about migration policy. It's also worth noting that whatever we are looking at later on, that women are now just 1/3 of migrants who migrate for employment, migrant workers. And that has been a huge achievement coming from over 50%. But still, the skills picture has not changed. Over 90% of women still migrate for either domestic work or unskilled work, which is the same. So we have to think about what Ramani was talking about also. What is the skills development? What is the value addition that we do? And whether we need to keep permitting or encouraging women to migrate for this low skill kind of work, because your question of decent work comes in because you're migrating into individual households where protection is impossible. And we speak of, constantly in the media about harassment and violence against migrant workers. But this is impossible to tackle given that they migrate into individual households. And there is a huge demand for care workers who can go into institutions. And this is a sector that we need to look at because the resetting is minimal in achieving this. So having put my 2 cents in there, let me come back to your question. Before I answer your question of what is my wish list for reform, I just want to look at why reforms have failed, because Sri Lanka has tried to reform labor law many times over. And this has failed because lack of political will for genuine reform. Because at the same time, when recommendations made after extensive consultations have been just dropped, thrown out, baby, bathwater, wash, everything. At the same time, something else comes in, like the retirement age law in November 2021, which no one has asked for, and which is virtually a dead letter because workers will keep retiring at 55 in order to withdraw their EPF benefits before the whole caboodle comes down in the economic crisis. So this is the perception, and the 60 means nothing. But no consultation, no request, except from one sector for a very specific reason, which is the plantation sector, where there was a huge brain drain of skilled managers, senior staff leaving at 55 and going into consultancies. They asked for the retirement age to be increased, but without doing that specifically for one sector, the minimum age of retirement was set for the first time by law in Sri Lanka at 60, where no one had asked for it. So this is clearly, again, political will. Same way, during the pandemic, we have not even started talking about the TEVA Act, which is, everybody's bugaboo, but it's really not, something that really benefits or affects a large part of the informal sector or the formal sector for that matter. So I didn't touch on that deliberately, but the maximum compensation under TEBA, the Termination of Employment of Workers Act, was 1.25 million. In the middle of a pandemic, when employers was already struggling, the minimum compensation is revised to 2.5 million with no consultation whatsoever. So you can see that there are lots of other agendas other than what is pragmatically needed, which has been the downfall of any labor reform effort. Very often, the most recent labor reform effort was in 2018, when there was a single labor law which was drafted, and many consultations were held across the board, but it was dropped for no reason, with no reasons being given. And the investment of over 2 years of research was just abandoned. But that is because it is led by external consultants and not by the government. And the consultants spent most of their time convincing the stakeholders, the trade unions, workers, labor officers themselves, that this was needed. And that is not sufficient. That is not good enough. This is the government of the day which has to take responsibility, which is difficult again given the musical chairs cabinets we have been having, where the incoming minister completely drops whatever agenda that has been there for labor law reform based on the current needs. So this has to be led by very firmly the highest office of the executive or the legislature. Because without that, labor law reform will simply not happen. And the government lacks capacity, but for goodness sake, get that capacity in, either by way of paid consultants or capacity building of your own people, but it has to be done from within, not from without, because many agendas, ulterior motives were attributed to this reform efforts many times over, not in just in the last cycle. There is lack of cohesion. As I said earlier, your development goals and your labor laws do not go hand in hand. And you have to look at what areas that you need to focus on, especially as Ramani said, employment creation is a no-brainer. But that is not possible under the current, it will not happen under the current labor law regime. Lack of trust between employers and trade unions. We are still in the colonial mindset of, the unions talking of neoliberalism and colonial oppressors and, exploitation and all that, without looking at this as a participatory effort. You need each other. And the trade unions really have not done any work at all in bringing the new entrants to the labor market into the trade union membership. I can ask Mr. Jaffarji how many employees of Advocata are members of a trade union, so or other entrepreneurs here. So the problem is that the unions are just trading on their prior reputation. They do not have any strength worth talking about, no negotiating strength, but still they have a prime seat at the table. So this must be changed either one way or another. You must increase trade union membership to genuinely represent those who need to have a seat at the table, or you have to take some sort of collective decision on the basis that we are part of this same effort and not competitors or oppressors and the oppressor. The lack of a trade union structure, as I have said last, is one of the key problems, because the Employers Federation represents employers, a fair number of employers, at least at labor law reform discussions, but the trade unions do not speak with one voice. They can't even agree on the minimum percentage of membership that is required for a trade union to be recognized for bargaining. So this really is my wish list, in the sense that you asked me to identify three. One is that labor law reform must be led by the highest level of government. Two is that the stakeholders must have a seat at the discussions for labor law reform. And three, which cuts across all of this, is that the dispute resolution mechanism must be made efficient, must be made productive, must not become a barrier and a hindrance to growth and employment creation. Thank you.
Thank you. And, I really enjoyed, Ramani, your tirade earlier. So I think all of us in this room are quite angry and quite frustrated, and we feel a lot of despair. So I guess the final question is to you. What are your 3 reforms that you'd like to see to take Sri Lanka out of this crisis?
Okay, the first one is the easy one, which has defied being dealt with, and that is to reform the law related to work time. Enable women who come under the Shop and Office Act to work at night, allow flexi hours, allow part-time work, not only for women, also for students. In advanced countries, waiters in restaurants, jobs like that, packers in supermarkets, they're students. So to deal with the problem of labor shortages in terms of bodies, we need to reform that particular law in addition to others. So that's the low-hanging fruit. The other one is, as I told you earlier, we need to upgrade our production structures, technologically move ahead. The incentives have to be given, people have to jump on board. I have to admit that actually it's not I who thought it, but one of my cousins, he said that it is our generation which failed. We didn't know enough about technology, we held others back from going ahead, and that is probably true. But we need to fix this. The third one, I mean, actually, even to speak about this, it frightens me. The whole situation of education. I mean, for 3 years, kids have not gone to school. I mean, children haven't learned to read or write. How is this going to affect the capacity of future workers? How are we going to fix it? There are children, say, who are in the primary cycle, the middle school cycle. When things were supposed to be good, they couldn't read or write or do maths properly. Now, how is it going to be? It is really frightening. And then this issue of malnutrition. People can't buy food, nutritious food. That is going to affect the cognitive abilities of children and affect their productivity. This is a time bomb which is ticking and which we have to address. And it's no point going through the education ministry and their syllabuses and do 10 subjects and all kinds of rubbish which is not necessary even, and which is not going to make them productive workers. All that stuff is stuffed into their heads. We don't need that. We need remedial education. We don't need this exam-oriented system which thinks that good exam marks mean functionality in skills. We don't need that. I think we need to move to a system which is more like the Danish system or the Finnish system, where it's continuous assessment and children are tested for what they can do, not what they know. And this is the time for that, because we don't have time to waste. Getting all those people, the 18-year-old will be 21 when he or she finishes this syllabus and leaves school. Can we afford that? In this country where we have an aging population, we have to the other things, we have to increase the school day. This 7:30 to 1:30 is nonsense. Increase it to 3:30 and then push them out of school by 16, 17 plus. That is how we can get the labor we need. Those are the 3 things.
Okay, thank you so much for this highly engaging conversation with 2 brilliant women. And I think that brings this panel discussion to a close. Thank you very much for participating in this conversation.
Thank you.